Hi everyone, Quiveen here from the comfort of my kitchen. In today's video, we are going to be looking at yet another conjunction. This conjunction is a little bit different from the conjunctions that we've taken a look at recently, and among those conjunctions were a conjunction of Saturn and Venus. So we can just about see this happening here around the 7th, so this is just past, of course, but there's Saturn and Venus nice and close together in the sky. This is another conjunction of Saturn that we will be looking at. In our previous video, where we looked at various planetary conjunctions, we looked forward into the end of March to see a conjunction between Mercury and Mars. Of course, that one wasn't visible from Ireland. We had to head pretty close to the equator to see it, but here we go, coming up on the 15th, there's Mercury and Mars very close together. And if we keep moving forward, we'll see Saturn coming around to morning time. So Saturn, over the course of, well, really the end of March and into the beginning of April, Saturn is going to be moving from one side of the sun to the other. And this is a kind of conjunction. This is a superior conjunction, which would seemingly indicate that it is better, but of course, superior conjunctions are almost always worse than any other kind. So the superior conjunction is when a planet is directly in line with the sun on the opposite side of the sun to the Earth. So of course, this is the only kind of conjunction with the sun that the planets outside of the Earth's orbit can have. So this is Saturn in line with the sun. Saturn is behind the sun, on the opposite side of the sun from our perspective. And I think, yeah, it may be here, it may be closer to here. But of course, Saturn will be more or less on the wrong side of the sun for a couple of days. But Saturn is pretty far from the sun here. We can see Saturn quite far underneath the sun. This would suggest that close to sunset, down in the southern hemisphere, you might get to see Saturn over the sun as it sets. This is something that we got to do with one of Venus's superior conjunctions quite recently, relatively recently at least. So here we are going back to sunrise, with the sun rising in the east and setting in the west. I always need to correct myself for the hemisphere that we're on. Unfortunately, because Saturn is pretty much directly behind the sun, the angle here is preventing us from seeing Saturn. We might have a better chance if we're a little bit closer to the equator. So we'll try that. There should be close enough to the equator to try at least. The superior conjunction is almost always a pretty boring conjunction because we don't get to see the planets that are in that position. And here, yeah, Saturn looks to be to the side of the sun. This would be before its superior conjunction, I believe, at least. And Saturn would be visible under ideal conditions if we had a perfectly flat horizon, which of course we can generate. So here we go. We'll get our perfectly flat horizon, and we may also need to move into the countryside to minimize the amount of light pollution. That would also maximize our chances of seeing Saturn because of course there is a lot of light just as the sun is setting. Superior conjunctions almost always block the planet in question from view, and that's pretty much what we're seeing here. Even though under certain conditions, such as recently with Venus, you can see the planet at sunset or sunrise, because even though it is in line with the sun from our perspective, or at least more or less in line with the sun, it is on the opposite side of the sun from our perspective, but it's not directly in line. It's not a perfect alignment of three objects. Similar to how the new moon will pass in front of the sun, but not necessarily in line with the sun. So we will demonstrate that here as well while we're looking at the daytime sky with no atmosphere, which of course lets us take a look at the sun and the planets all together, all at the same time. So here we have the new moon and we can see the moon is essentially facing us with its nighttime side. The moon is between us and the sun, but it's not directly in line. Of course, if it was directly in line, we'd be getting a solar eclipse. Very similarly with the planets, even though the planets will pass behind the sun, relatively speaking, they're not always going to directly line up. We saw this recently enough as well with the inner planets. There we've got Venus and Mars making a close conjunction. In this instance, Mars would be on the far side of the sun because Mars is further from the sun than we are. And based on how bright Venus is, I would assume, yeah, Venus is on the far side of the sun there as well. So planets like Venus and Mercury, they can come between the sun and the earth. And I believe Mercury here, yeah, that's Mercury on the far side of the sun. Usually planets on the far side of the sun will be quite bright because they're fully illuminated. They're essentially in their full phase. We'll come around until there's Mercury. This is a new Mercury. We can see that it's darker, it's much harder to see because its nighttime side is facing us. So this is Mercury between us and the sun. This is an inferior conjunction, which only happens with the inner planets, planets that are closer to the sun than we are. Inner planets like Mercury and Venus, they can have both superior and inferior conjunctions. The planets outside the Earth's orbit, including Mars, but especially Saturn and Jupiter, they can only have these superior conjunctions. And again, superior sounds like it will be better, but in these instances we don't actually get to see them. It's much better to see them for us at opposition when they're directly behind us on the same side of the sun. If we went through enough time here, and we do have time, we'll go through variety of times here. We'll move forward into the year. This should be Mercury. Yeah, this is Mercury in superior conjunction, but actually lining up with the sun, actually going directly behind it. So that, of course, does happen as well. Occasionally planets, their Venus or their Uranus is directly behind the sun in superior conjunction. It has to be. There's no other option for Uranus. We can see here Jupiter passing directly behind the sun, superior conjunction, much closer than where we saw Saturn, but still not directly in line with the sun. So similarly to the moon, not always passing directly in front of the sun, only occasionally causing a solar eclipse, we see the same with the planets and their conjunctions. Whether they're superior or inferior conjunctions, I believe that's another. This is an inferior conjunction of Mercury. It's not quite lining up directly with the sun. If it was, we'd get a transit of Mercury, and of course transits of Mercury and transits of Venus, they're fairly rare, they're fairly uncommon. We only get them every now and again, and that's because generally the planets aren't going to perfectly line up with the sun. All of the orbits of the planets are at least slightly inclined away from the ecliptic. A lot of the time the ecliptic is defined based on the Earth's equator and how the Earth's equator relates to the orbit around the sun and the orbits of the other planets. But even the Earth is a little bit inclined from the equator of the sun itself, if the equator of the sun was projected out into space. But we can see here, going through basically an entire year, the vast majority of these conjunctions, superior and inferior, they're not perfect alignments. They're not occultations of the planet by the sun, even though I don't think we'd normally use the term occultation to describe something going behind the sun, but an actual zigzag, a perfect alignment of three objects. That's not always the case. In fact, that's usually not the case with these kinds of conjunctions. It's only occasionally. We can see there with Mercury a little bit later this year. Only occasionally will these alignments be perfect, will the object actually be blocked out by the sun. So of course this is a conjunction that we can't see, the superior conjunction of Saturn. Most superior conjunctions we can't see, but at least you've gotten a chance to see what it would look like here. And I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please do like it. If you like this kind of content, then please subscribe to my YouTube channel. And if you'd like more of my content, you can see it on my other channels, Caoimhín's Other Content and Caoimhín's Content Os Gaeilge, which has a couple of new videos up on it as of recent. You can also read this information and keep track of all of my videos on my website, Caoimhín's businesscontent.ie. Thank you very much for watching, and hopefully I'll see you back here next time.